Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. On behalf of LexisNexis, I welcome you all to the launch of the 19th edition of A. Ramaiah Guide to the Companies Act. The release of this edition will be followed by a discussion on decoding the changing landscape of company law in India by our eminent panelists who are the contributing authors of this new edition. Ramaya, since its first publication in 1956, has exceptionally stood out in every way for its meticulous research, well written commentary, description of legislative intent, extensive coverage of Indian and foreign judicial precedents, as well as procedural aspects, and is also a universally recognized as the most authoritative work on corporate law in India. This, the 19th edition of Ramaiah, has been comprehensively revised and updated by the subject matter experts with rich experience in regulatory, compliance, litigation, transaction advisory, as well as accounting and auditing. This new edition covers all the amendments up to the Companies Amendment Act 2020, as also the relaxations and exemptions allowed because of COVID-19. A special offering with this edition is a supplement covering amendments introduced by the Companies Amendment Act 2020. This supplement will be directly sent to the customers by publisher free of charge upon sharing requisite details using the QR code given on the opening page of Volume 1. So, Mr. Arvind Datar, please share your thoughts on the 19th edition of Ramaiah.
Well, let me congratulate all of you for bringing out this edition. I must congratulate Arjun and the team for a very elegant edition. It's got a very nice, dignified, elegant look. And when I saw the 19th edition, it took me back down memory lane to 1988 when I first got associated with Ramaiah. As you know, my excise book had just been published, and then Erstwhile publishers had taken over the copyright. And so then that's how I started associating myself with Ramaiah. It was initially a very challenging period because the 91 edition of the book came along with the Company Law Board, and there was a huge amount of increase in company litigation at that point of time. I had a wonderful experience of editing the book. We had 10 lawyers in Chennai and some chartered accountants who would make all the additions, corrections, and send it to Mr. Zeshi Shah. I don't know how many of you know that when the erstwhile publishers took over Ramaiah, they first requested Mr. Palkhiwala to be the chief editor. And he said that he didn't have the time, and he recommended the name of Justice J.C. Shah, who at that time had his chambers in Kunte and Company, used to work out of there. And Justice J.C. Shah did the editing. I can tell you with great pride that whatever slips I would get from 10 lawyers, we put them together. I would edit it, clear it, and send it to Mr. J.C. Shah. And he would meticulously edit those slips and send it back. All those days, there was no electronics, everything was done manually. And we had these huge sheets where we used to paste the old page and mark the new page and so on. But Justice J.C. Shah, despite his busy practice, took the trouble of editing everything. He would make many changes, not agree with us. And we tried to put in new comments. Wherever there was no commentary, we would say that it is submitted that and give our commentary. So that's how we started Ramaiah, and then it went on for many, many years. I must just also recollect to you the one sad episode on a personal note as far as I'm concerned. I always wanted to meet Justice J.C. Shah. I had always admired his judgments in the bank nationalization case, in the Privy Purses case, and he was one of the greatest Chief Justices, though for a short time. So I had gone to Pune for a function, and I had taken the Deccan Queen to Bombay to go and see him. And Mr. Wadhwa had given me his address and so on. And while I was in the train, I met a lawyer from Bombay, and he told me that, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm going to Bombay. I've got to meet Justice J.C. Shah this afternoon." And he said, "Didn't you see the Times of India today?" I said, "No, he passed away yesterday." So that was a very sad thing, and I could never meet him, to my eternal regret. Of course, I kept in touch with Satish Shah for many, many years, but that was a sad part. Over the years, we did a lot of work on Ramaiah. When we first took the book, it was just about one volume. And I remember how we had got Butterworth company law cases whole set, and we added a lot of English cases, Palmer company law cases. Then we had number of references to JBL, Journal of Business Law, and we had got all those books, and we would cull out the principles, read the English Act, see to what extent it is familiar, and bring out the principles. So over the years, I had a association, and I must say that whatever company law I know is because of this book. I was doing some winding up cases in the Madras High Court, but only when I started editing this book, we really learned a lot of company law. Then later on, I had to, thanks to LexisNexis, they asked me to do Kanga Palkhiwala and other books and so on. So my attention to this got diluted. But of course, I was confident that we have got a wonderful team of editors. I can see Bharat Vasani, I can see Mr. Ravichandran, I can see Mr. Katare, I can see all eminent people here who took over. And therefore, I was very, very confident that this book will go from strength to strength. I wish this a great success. It will definitely be a happy new year for the entire editorial team that you bought it despite COVID and on the eve of the coming new year. And I'm looking forward to the 20th, 21st, 22nd editions as the edition go by. Thank you so much. Sorry I took some time, but I wanted to share my thoughts, my initial association with the book, and how we used to do it. It is such a tremendous change with electronic media. There, everything we had to be pasted with arrows and colors and so on, massive sheets, and they would be sent by big parcels by post. Everything would take several days at a time. I used to be in Nagpur at that time for the editing and so on. But anyway, it was a wonderful experience. Thanks to LexisNexis, my association continued. And Arjun, you, Priyanka, all the entire team, all the editors, wish you all the very best and good luck. And may you have many more editions. God bless. Thank you.
Thank
I think it's a great honor to have been asked to have been invited to be a chief editor of this legal classic. I've been associated with this book for a while in different capacities, because I come from a family of lawyers who have been editors for a long time. The law of evidence has crossed 100 years. I'm the fourth generation now. But apart from that, of course, I had the privilege of being taught and being associated with some of the outstanding authors and editors that you can think of, all very well-known names: Glanville Williams on criminal law, Jennings and Lauterpacht on international law, Gareth Jones on equity, specific performance, and so on. I was very close to many of them. So I could see how much work they would put in every day of their life to keep on, books moving and legal classic. Unfortunately, what happens is that the legal profession is all to do with making money. So busy professionals somehow don't find the time to take time off to edit books. But what I find, of course, is very good in this case is that, Arjun, you have been able to, marshal a large number of extremely competent editors who have joined you despite their busy schedule. And what is, of course, very good, I find, is some young lawyers have joined, including young professionals, accountants and company secretaries and so on. Because one good thing about, law also has an intellectual side. I think Mr. Arvind Datta will join me there, which people forget. Like the medical science, you can see as an intellectual side, which is now going on because of COVID-19. We can see how the medical science is looking at, using their intellect to produce something extraordinary. So a young lawyer, if he has time, then of course, if he devotes his time to even writing a bit or editing a bit, that remains with him forever. That is something which you will never forget. Rather than getting ready for a case, and then you, after a while, another case comes, more cases come, you tend to forget. You have to depend on your juniors. But once you do some editorial work, that is something will always remain with you, and you will remain an expert in that field. I can assure you. I mean, from my personal experience, I can tell you, if you keep on doing this editorial work. But then that said, it's all about Ramaya, not about myself. But it's good that you can chase young lawyers and young professionals, maybe accountants, maybe company secretaries, to devote more time, although maybe financially not that rewarding, but it will be intellectually stimulating and very rewarding. You have produced a fantastic book. Undoubtedly, you got a great team of outstanding editors. I hope they keep on editing Ramaya from time to time. They're not as old as I am, so I suppose they will be able to be associated with more volumes. Thank you very much, everyone. Nice to see all of you well. Thank you.
Now, maybe request our chief editors and panelists to mark the official release of this 19th edition by holding up their copies on screen. Can we now proceed to the discussion? And here I request our moderators, Mr. Vinod Kothari and Mr. Kalidas Ramaswamy, to start the discussion.
So to start the proceedings, to set the ball rolling, as it were, the first question, in fact, I'm directing this question to Mr. Bharat Vasani. As we are aware, the Companies Act, Amendment Act 2200 has brought in a lot of provisions where it comes to decriminalization of offences under the Act. Now, this can act, to my mind, as a double-edged sword, in the sense that it can either encourage voluntary compliance, or alternatively, it can bring about a certain amount of complacency in the corporates, because given the fact that the the reputation risk, that is the loss of personal reputation arising out of prosecution, is off the promoter's head, as it were. But for his views on the provisions relating to decriminalization, can we have Mr. Bharat Vasani, please?
Yes. Very good evening to all of you. Am I clearly audible?
Yes, you are, sir.
Thank you. Very good evening to all of you. Thank you, Mr. Datar, for your very thoughtful introduction and giving us the perspective of how this rich history of Ramaya's Companies Act. I have my little provocative views on this decriminalization aspect, which Mr. Ramaswamy has asked me to. I've written a blog also on this. My issue is this, that decriminalization of company law in India really started as soon as the liberalization of Indian economy started in 1991. And the first commercial law which got decriminalized was the Imports and Exports Control Act 1947, which was replaced by the Foreign Trade Development Regulation Act, which was completely civil penalties and the earlier law had all fines and imprisonments, and second law had only monetary penalties. But I think the first major attempt was made by the government of India when FERA was replaced with FEMA. FERA was very draconian, as all of you know, and FEMA, when it came on 2000, had virtually only monetary penalties for everything. Now, so company law is also moving in that direction of removing the fines and imprisonments and levying the monetary penalty. But there are two disturbing facts about the new decriminalization bill which got passed in the last session of Parliament, though the new act is yet not notified. First is that whenever the previous laws got decriminalized, the government of India also did one thing. The Parliament increased the penalty 3 to 4 times. Like FEMA, the penalty is 3 times the amount of foreign exchange inward if you violate. While in case of Companies Act, the trend surprisingly and shockingly, I would say, is reverse. That not only you are decriminalizing the law, but you are reducing the penalty amount also. So the monetary penalties have gone down. Second thing, the yardsticks which were used by the Company Law Committee of 2019 to decriminalize was a very simpleton yardstick, that all the offences which are compoundable under section 441 of the Act should be decriminalized. I think it required a more nuanced approach. What has happened as a result, that some of the very serious offences like related party transactions in a listed company, wrong disclosures in prospectus, misuse of section 8 company, which is association not for profit, and not detecting fraud in the auditor's report. Some of those serious offences which has significant public money is involved are also decriminalized. Now, there are arguments both for and against decriminalization. The proponents of decriminalization say that criminal law does not go well with the corporate world, and it is not really required, and it doesn't gel well with the overall corporate situation. And monetary penalty is enough. If there's a serious problem, IPC is any case there. While the opponents say that business will start treating this nominal penalty of 10,000 and 25,000 rupees as a cost of doing business in India, and the seriousness with which the company law should not become a kind of a toothless legislation. That is the fear which people have. In my opinion, we require a very calibrated approach between what is allowing the monetary penalties to come in for no technical violations, but where there's a serious violation, where there's a substantial amount of public money involved, decriminalization, in my opinion, is not a good step. I wish the government of India and the parliament takes a more calibrated approach to this entire exercise, because currently the buzzword in every corridors of power is decriminalize. I believe Ministry of Finance has come out with a long list of statutes which they want to decriminalize. I think the approach, they need to identify the factors, they need to choose to identify the offenses which need to be decriminalized. You can't do a wholesale decriminalization like the way it is done in the Companies Act, where some of the very serious offenses have got decriminalized. So, and another thing is the sharp U-turns, like Section 90 relating to SBO. It was heavily criminalized by 2019 Amendment Act, made it as a fraud under Section 447, and 2020 says decriminalized. CSR, which was not even an offense under previous act, in 2019 we provided the 3 years imprisonment, and 2020 we said decriminalize it. So I think there has to be a consistency in legislative policy. You can't have a knee-jerk reaction where in 2019 you criminalize a law, in 2020 you decriminalize it. It looks terrible, absolutely optics-wise. And my sense is you are sending wrong signals that it's fine to violate the company law, you have to pay a nominal penalty and be done with it. So I think there is a much more calibrated, reasoned approach required in this entire exercise. You can't just pick and say that all the offenses which are listed as a compoundable offenses should be decriminalized. It should be a very careful selection of offenses for decriminalization. Thank you.
The second question is again generic, as I said. This law is actually a law which is actually you find there is a preponderance of subordinate legislation in this law, unlike the predecessor act. Now, subordinate legislation has an advantage of easier implementation, but at the same time, it can produce amendments at the drop of a hat by way of a knee-jerk reaction. And the disquieting factor in this law is the fact that, the subordinate legislation in many places overrides the provisions of the Act. So therefore, I would like Mr. Ravichandran to share his views on this subordinate legislation, and to what extent is the dependence on subordinate legislation justified, given the fact that the law can be subjected to a huge amount of change without the rigors of parliamentary procedure.
Yeah, good evening to everyone, and congratulations to everyone, and especially to LexisNexis team. The question is very interesting, because ever since the the Act in 2030 was introduced, if you were to just look at the various amendments that have come, that have been coming, that are in the pipeline now, in respect of various provisions, the rules, it will be mind-boggling, so much so that I can say the word prescribed is the most frequently used word throughout the statute. That is the way in which, and you may have difficulties in getting some sort of a fixed tenure for a particular provision. It is going to be frequently floating, and in my opinion, there are various rules wherein we can move it to the substantive law, and there are various provisions in the substantive law which could be moved to the rules. So there must be some sort of a balance. Maybe a relook is necessary. In my opinion, the less we go to the rules, the better would be the operation of the law and the reliability of the law. Otherwise, at the drop of a hat, anything can be changed. For example, the change in the explanation was brought about in rule number 6 with respect to the transfer of shares to the IEPF. So much so, if you read the explanation now, even in a 1932 company, if a dividend had not been declared, and for years nobody has picked up, those shares have to also to be transferred, is what the rule makers have introduced by way of an explanation. And therefore, there is an opportunity of judicial minds not sitting over and a parliamentary whole intellectual discussion, or the political, economical, and a social discussion that is likely to happen in a parliament sort of amendment is going to be missing when you're going to give so much power to the rule makers to keep on amending the rules. That is my view.
The other question I have in mind is that, this is relating to the domain of independent directors. I'm not asking this question specifically to anyone. Whomsoever wishes to answer can do so. See, the independent directors is a concept which has been introduced in the Act for the first time. Of course, it was there in the clause 49 of the listing agreement, but the legal recognition to the concept of an independent director is an accomplishment of this Act. Now, having said that, empirical evidence suggests that where it comes to joining a board, independent directors, I mean, the distinguished persons are averse to the idea of joining the board because of the possibility of being exposed to the onerous responsibility that the law thrusts on them. So, therefore, much as you would say that independence is a state of the mind, what eventually happens is that under the garb of independent directors, the promoters invariably get people that are their golf partners or bridge partners, etc., and carry on with the euphemism of independent directors, which is a very sad state of affairs indeed. But what the law could perhaps do to draw independent directors into the fold is that, of course, there is an insulation available under the Act under Section 149, where it comes to liability of the independent directors being exposed only in the case of any dereliction of their responsibilities. But in the backdrop of the fact that you need to have independent directors of quality, is there a case for withdrawing exonerating the entire population of independent directors to any legal responsibility under the Act? That's my question. Anyone can respond, please.
So this is Siddheshwar Bhalla. In fact, I am a risk professional all across I've been in my life. So thanks to Mr. Datar and Mr. Sarkar, and they were also mentioning that there are lawyers as well as company secretaries, chartered accountants and accountants. So I'm not typically an accountant, but yes, I am a chartered accountant and company secretary, but as a risk professional, I've been there, and I've been actually looking at corporate governance in organizations. And when we talk about independent directors, to just elaborate on that, I think it's more to do in terms of what are the governance norms in an organization and how the Companies Act and various other legislations have somewhere contributed to this journey. See, if we look at it in the light of changes in the Companies Act, particularly in 2013, if I refer section 134, 143, 177, and there are others as well, which talked about certain governance initiatives that organizations should take. And even if you look at the LODR, so the listing obligation and disclosure requirements, it talks about all of these things. Now they talk about that the board of directors of companies are required to ensure compliance with the provisions of these, which talks about raising the bar of corporate governance in organizations. In fact, if I share with you what used to be recommendatory, say a couple of years back, or maybe around 2 decades back, around 1991, when the globalization was being talked about. So there were a lot of white papers which came out either through the Confederation of Indian Industries, Department of Company Affairs, also Naresh Chandra Committee, Ryan Murthy Committee, and they all were recommendatory. They talked about various governance norms should be there, which has now got in a mandatory mode under the Companies Act, which we see now. Accordingly, the independent directors, they have become more conscious and cautious to ensure that the corporates are complying with these provisions. Now, just to share with you, based on my experience also, many organizations have taken proactive steps to conduct some sort of orientation sessions as well for newly appointed independent directors, so that we can bring them to speed and apprising them of the duties and responsibilities with respect to the corporate governance and other accounting norms as well, which are expected to be discharged by independent directors. And this is something which I feel can be replicated across all organizations and perhaps considered to be made mandatory as well, because practical sessions are more fulfilling and they are easily implementable as well. In fact, this also complements well with the move by the MCA to conduct common examination for independent directors. So I think it's more to do with with apprising and bringing up to speed the independent director, the expectations, what the stakeholders have from the board of directors, and obviously independent directors are a critical part. And once this thing is done, I think in terms of looking at organizations, how maturely, from a governance perspective, the organizations are moving, it's actually giving a complete twist and turn. And I'm sure somewhere when we talk about certain, so once on one side you have responsibilities, on the other side you have got certain liabilities also which may come up. But once the responsibilities are discharged to the full satisfaction of all the stakeholders, I think we just try to look at it a bit positively. The other side, in terms of any sort of penal consequences, would definitely get reduced. So that's my 2 cents on this. Yeah.
Actually, I have been independent director for about 8 years in 2 listed companies. So recently, I had also passed out common proficiency assessment, self-assessment exam of IICA of MCA, constituted under Section 151 of the Companies Act, 2013. So this is a good start. Set that now whosoever wants to become independent director, at least they should have a proficiency certified by the Institute of Corporate Affairs of the MCA. So that is a plus point. And then as an independent director, I felt since we are taking part into this audit committee meeting, I am chairperson audit committee also. So we definitely actually are a value addition for the company, because only financially literate person can be made chairperson of the audit committee. So that way, that compliance and financial discipline may be coming more and more in the companies, and it will contribute to the corporate governance in the long run. That is my view.
Yeah. Can we move on to the next question?
I just wanted to add one point. Can I do that?
Yeah,
because
please.
Mr. Kalidas Ramaswamy was very directly raising this point of exonerating the independent directors completely. For example, if you read this section 149(12), it has got certain checks and balances. It is introducing a provision where the contravention with respect to the Companies Act, of course, is attributable to an action on the part or non-action on the part of the independent directors, consenting, conniving. Therefore, I feel that there are sufficient safeguards in the definition of officer in default, as well as in the limited relief afforded under the Companies Act in 149(12). If you remember, recently SAT also passed an order in, I believe, if I remember correct, Somakesh Shekhar Sundaresan will be able to easily tell, Adi Cooper case or somewhere, the independent director was directly found to be liable through the board process with respect to certain issue of shares and routing of funds and all. So board process is sufficient to nail the independent director's complicity in relation to contravention. And unlike Companies Act having a provision specially for relief, the other laws, economic laws we used to say, have always been saying the same thing: if you are directly responsible or if you have consented or connived. So I believe that this is a good provision which is sufficient, but it does not answer the larger question: where are independent directors really independent? That is, of course, a separate question which is very difficult to find an answer.
I second what Mr. Ravichandran said, in the sense that, as long as the independent directors are following the board processes, they will be exonerated. Like, ask the right questions at the right time while participating in the meetings. In case they do not do that and gloss over whatever are the facts, which are strikingly available or come across very easily through the agenda papers, then I think unfortunately they become liable and they are punished. They get punished or they are penalized. So that's my short point there.
Okay. This question, in fact, we haven't heard Mr. Somsekhar, so I am therefore directing this question specifically to him. Sir, the audit committee is, to my mind, the fountainhead of corporate governance today, and therefore it's sacrilegious to, sort of color the constitution of the committee. But one disconcerting fact is that whilst the Companies Act says that the audit committee shall consist of the majority of independent directors, and SEBI regulations say that 2/3 should comprise of independent directors. Now, neither the Act nor the regulations say that the balance, that is apart from, except for the fact that we're in a company where there are special equity which has been issued, where all the constituents, all the members of the audit committee have to be independent. But in other cases, the law is silent on the point whether an executive director can be part of the committee. Now, of course, the LODR says somewhere that the finance director may be called upon to contribute by the committee to answer certain questions relating to financial statements. But per se, there is nothing to suggest that an executive director can be part of the cannot be part of the audit committee. So therefore, taking if I may use an expression strongly, taking advantage of this position, we have the unfortunate specter of some even leading listed companies appointing executive directors on the board, which to my mind is anathema to the entire concept of independence. So what is your view on this, sir? Should an executive director who is involved in operations be part of the committee?
Okay, the question really is not about whether you should have an oasis of sorts, leaving all the executives out in the desert in these committees. The point is about, it's not about keeping the executives out altogether, in my view. Ultimately, remember, governance is about committee and collective minds coming together with a check and balance on the executive. So I do think that it's conscious that the executive is not explicitly kept out. Our constitutional framework is, unless something is explicitly prohibited by law, every act of human agency is permitted. So you don't need a provision to say they're permitted to be there. The provisions provide for a majority of independence, which means in a minority, the executives can be there. The question really is the quality and the effectiveness of the forum. We've had too many forums where the executive need not even be a part of it, but they would be happy to kowtow to the needs of the executive. So I don't think we should get too hung up about the composition and the presence of an executive or two. The real question is the effectiveness despite the majority of the committee being independent people. I think that's the way I would look at it.
Only one, if I may add, in other geographical jurisdictions, the emphasis is on having independent directors and non-executive directors that are not part of the promoters. If you look at the UK code on governance, the SEC regulations, the Singapore provisions, Australia also. So, therefore, why should, if you are trying to be standing shoulder to shoulder in terms of severity of the legislation, why should India make a difference?
Yeah, I think we have to think through our concept in our society as well. Frankly, our understanding of independence is force-fitting a different social reality. In most of the jurisdictions you mentioned, it is not the norm to have a substantial majority called a promoter controlling and running the show in a company. These tend to be truly independent from the executive rather than independent from ownership. In India, we have a peculiar problem where ownership and management fuses into one. So you need independence from owners and independence from management. It's an added dimension, and that presents a complexity. And frankly, where is the ecosystem? Where are the independent directors? Where are the companies to attract the high quality independent directors as well? So I think we need to evolve a little more. There won't be an ideal world at this time, but I dare say some executive members in some companies make excellent independent directors in other companies. I do know that chief executives of some companies perform a fantastic role as independents in unconnected companies. So we really need to nurture this ecosystem and create something more. Because just doing a legal stipulation is not going to achieve the outcomes we desire.
May I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, to my mind also, the executive director can as much be part of the audit committee in any event. See, at least the majority of the directors are independent, non-executive directors, and we have, or even for listed companies, 2/3 are in the non-executive directors. So, and in any event, executive director is a person who has actual knowledge of the affairs of the company, and so he will be able to contribute effectively. And at the end of the day, it's a mindset. Well-governed companies, executive directors contribute a big deal, and I feel they'll be able to add a lot of value to the deliberations of the audit committee.
Now, my question actually was basically on this, that whilst the law does not prevent an executive director from participating in the deliberations, the fact that he should not be a member comes from this, that he should not be in a position to influence an independent body and undermine the independence of the committee. That was the reason why I raised the question. And in fact, the law does permit, in fact, the managing director is always a permanent invitee to the deliberations of the audit committee. But the issue is basically on membership.
I would like to add here one anecdote. I was appearing before a 3-member arbitral tribunal headed by Justice B.P. Jeevan Reddy, and the opposite party came in with an application that my client was an industrialist, and if the arbitration is held in my place, there is likelihood of influencing the tribunal because they are the leaders in the industry. Justice BP Jeevan Reddy and the tribunal took offense to this. Do you mean to say we are capable of being influenced? I argued this case and won this case, but the point is your independence is back to the question. The question you are addressing fundamentally is about how you are independent. Whether you are capable of being influenced, yes, it can be. You can carry conviction. You may be able to convince the independent directors about the need for a proposal that is placed before the board.
I also think, frankly, it's a question of how effective the independents are in a given situation where they want the executive to leave the room. They should have the stature and the gravitas to say, we need to have a discussion just among the non-executives. It's a question of effectiveness, and I don't think that should be capable of being achieved by legislative stipulation. It's a question of practice. It's a question of gravitas that independent directors develop over time.
Before we proceed, I think we have Mr. Kothari back.
I have really enjoyed the interaction so far pertaining to the participation of executive directors in audit committees. It's been really very, enriching discussion. Well, let's move on to some of the other topics where we wanted to have deliberations today. But before that, I'll just start with a bit of nostalgia myself as well, as I've also been associated with Ramaiah like Mr. Arvind Datar since 1988. And I've also had the privilege of having to write on long, wide sheets of paper, pasting slips there and sending them over to Nagpur, etc. And I do recall the erstwhile publishers Vadavas telling me that the first copy of Ramaiah was always sent to Meenakshi Temple in Madurai. And I'm so very happy to learn from LexisNexis also that that tradition is still being continued. So it's extremely a privilege to be associated with this great publication. Coming to some of the issues for deliberation today, one of the questions we like to ponder over is how the jurisprudence of Companies Act has changed over time. And traditionally, we always had the view that companies are basically for the benefit of the shareholders. Companies work for shareholders. They work for shareholder wealth maximization, which was termed as what is called shareholder primacy theory. But over time, we realized that companies are now sitting on massive wealth. They're not only contributed by shareholders' money, they sit on lenders' money. They have massive impact on creditors and the society in general. And therefore, the situation now is that companies can no longer claim that they exist for shareholder wealth maximization. So on this major change over time, which is not just bringing the concept of so-called business responsibility or corporate social responsibility, but the larger fiduciary role of board of directors sitting in fiduciary position, not only for shareholders, but to stakeholders in general. On this major change in law, can we have some thoughts, let's say from Mr. Shekhar, and I would also like to have Mr. Somsekhar also contribute his view on this. Mr. Shekhar and Mr.
Yeah,
Somsekhar.
yeah, respected members. Uh, well, everything depends on the corporate governance policy and the ethos of the organization. A company with strong corporate governance practices will have a regard and they follow excellent practices with regard respect to all the stakeholders, whether be it the lenders, creditors, customers, and of course the shareholders. And if you see the example of companies, like take the case of many companies which are highly leveraged companies like Reliance, till recently, we had Bajaj Finance or say Bajaj Finserv, and you look at many of the large conglomerates, they have been able to maximize value for all the stakeholders. They have created enormous wealth, and they not only taken care of the interest of all the other lenders and other stakeholders, but they have also maximized shareholder value. At the other end of the spectrum, you also have companies which are zero debt companies, mostly the MNCs. If you look at Hindustan Lever, you look at Nestle, and even many of the other companies like Asian Paints, they are zero debt companies. They have been able to maximize shareholder value and create enormous return on equity for the shareholders. So, and whereas if you look at some other set of companies, they have neither maximized, because of a wrong corporate governance, failure of risk management practices, they have failed both for the lenders as well as the shareholders. Like many of the companies which have been referred to NCLT, so the creditors the lenders got a small percentage of the value and the shareholder value was completely written off. So this was a case where they failed both for the stakeholders, for all the stakeholders, they fail to generate value. So I think we need to take a fundamental shift, paradigm shift in corporate governance. The focus has been more on the tick box approach and board structures and practices. But I think that we have to see a paradigm shift to risk management. Risk management, to my mind, has been grossly underrated in many of the organizations. That is why we had over 10 trillion crore of, we have over 10 trillion of NPAs, more than 10 lakh crores of NPAs, and equal more than 10 to 15 lakh crores of stressed assets. This was a complete, despite all the corporate governance practices and despite the tick box, this has been a complete failure of corporates and failure of corporate governance across banks and across the many of the organizations. So essentially, I think one needs to, since Vinod has raised the lender's perspective, we need to have very, very strong risk management practices, and that has to be at the top of the list. That has been, unfortunately, the focus has always been, if you see all committees, always risk management has just been barely been mentioned, and it has been more of board structures and practices. So essentially, once people have a strong corporate governance ethos and focus on effective risk management policies, and they are able to take care of the interest of not only the lenders, the customers, the creditors, and stakeholders, and create enormous wealth for the shareholders as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Shekhar. Mr. Somsekhar would like to add on that, and I know Mr. Bharat Vasani is also wanting to add on that. Mr. Somsekhar first. Sir, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. I think the question would be summarized as thus. I mean, in terms of where are we in the scale moving from shareholder interest to stakeholder interest being at the heart of a company's existence. It is something that, again, as an ecosystem, we have to develop. We are the third largest economy in purchasing power terms, but completely out of step on discount. Here again, one of the main reasons is we seek to achieve governance by legislating. Legislating virtue doesn't work. Legislation can only nudge you towards something. Ultimately, it's about what the system expects you and what society lets you get away with. And for that, your common law courts and your tort litigation is what drives the quality. If you look at shareholder activism and governance standards in the other parts of the world, they've developed essentially because of the quality of tort action. Here, somehow we have a converse evidence. In fact, any litigation around even operation mismanagement, people are still citing Kalinga and LIC versus Escort. Jurisprudence that belongs to day before yesterday of the 80s. So I do think we have to scale up as a society. Section 166 makes a motherhood statement about directors having to be mindful of all stakeholders. Now that's again a legislative step towards achieving what should otherwise have been achieved by development of tort-based law. So again, it's a 2013 Act. We have a class action suit provision without the trappings of CPC. Where are the class action suits, even in a tribunal, without the trappings of CPC and Evidence Act? So as an ecosystem, unless stakeholders litigation goes up, I don't see this changing. In fact, it's very shareholder centric. And remember, our composition of shareholding is substantial shareholding in promoter hands. And that's a very powerful constituency which controls the evolution on this side. So unless something socially changes, I don't see this changing. It can't change by changing law.
Right. Mr. Bhartavasani, wanted to add on that?
Yeah. I would like to endorse what Som said and add two more things. I think there's a huge confusion, particularly the younger generation of lawyers, that the stakeholder concept was introduced only because Section 166 was formally brought in the statute book. Much prior to this, the common law, the director's fiduciary duty is always extended to all the stakeholders. It's just that some people believe that directors' duties have come only because of Companies Act 2013. That would be quite ridiculous. Secondly, I believe that fundamentally the Indian ecosystem is such that you see today Section 245, which introduced class action lawsuit, and there were some proxy advisory firm who thought that there will be a kind of slew of class actions, but not a single one has been filed till date, or one or two, maybe nothing has come really. Government of India recently liberalized the rules also for filing class action suits, but nothing has happened. My point I want to make is that only legislative change which has come is the IBC, where IBC has statutorily mandated the board of directors that when the company is in a twilight zone on the verge of bankruptcy, the directors' fiduciary duties move from shareholders to creditors, and they are statutorily, not contractually or generally, but statutorily obliged to look at the interest of the creditors, and they need to see that if the company is not in a position to repay the loans, then they should tell the company to stop carrying on the business and stop trading. So I think in this country, nothing happens unless you are statutorily nudged or directed to do something. But the ecosystem is not still favorable to stakeholder concern. And by and large, most of the corporate boards, whether it's multinational or Indian companies, predominantly look at the interest of the largest shareholder, and the rest of the things fall in place.
Right.
We have a long way to go compared to when you see the companies in the West. We speak about it. You send integrated annual report, 500 pages, 550 pages, all big stories, but in practice, nothing happens. It's all shareholders and nothing else.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the contribution. I'm now coming to a topic which is a bit sensitive, sensational perhaps, which is the introduction of tribunals for delivery of justice. And I'm sure all of you would see that there's a major change that happened from 56 Act to 2013 Act is almost all the functions of courts have been shifted to the tribunals. We have had almost 5-6 years of existence of the tribunals, including the appellate tribunal, which continues to function from Delhi as of now. At this point of time, how do we see the process of shifting of delivery of justice from courts to tribunals? Is it something which is a success? Has it really allowed companies to address their issues on delivery of justice? Maybe I'll first like to hear Mr. Arvind Pandian on this question, and maybe then others also. There are a lot of legal professionals in this meeting today and might like to probably share their views. But let's start from Mr. Arvind Pandian. Mr. Pandian, please.
Thank you, Mr. Kothari. It's my privilege first to thank Mr. Arjun and his team and team LexisNexis for continuing the wonderful epic of Ramayya so long. I'm not as old as either Mr. Kothari or Mr. Datar in regard to the age as being participant with Ramayya. I started sometime in the 97 edition when Mr. Palkiwala edition had come with the golden one. So that was my first interaction with the Vadwas, and then now. So just to add a word of appreciation that it's so nostalgic and sentimental to be continuing to be part of this esteemed group as well as also the organization. Thank you for giving this opportunity also for being part of this discussion. Coming to this topic, I think Mr. Kothari rightly summed it up in one word. It's a very sensitive topic. Gone are the days where we could just say, on a forum and walk away. We could see that button called recording also going there. As a lawyer, our antennas go twice up before we sometimes say too freely also. And this is going to be on YouTube forever. And this is Arvind Pandyan's view for future also. So I'd like to have a guarded response. Firstly, not as a panelist alone, but also as a lawyer. Having been, at least Soma always is at the SAC to equal extent. I'm always at the NCLT or at the NCLAT for the last 5 years, I should say, Mr. Ravichandran also to a great extent. Our experience has been, I should say, I cannot rate it as such. I can only say that we have been having a pretty good experience. I think I'm putting it a little bit positively. I would not like to use it in terms at all. I think as I heard also some of the panelists say, we are very, very good at forming institutions, framing the law, giving the rules, laying down the procedure. But when it comes to absolute application, that's where I think the professionals or the regulators falter a great deal. And we lawyers are no exception. So speaking for the law here and the lawyer here, we speak a lot of philosophy along with the law. But when it comes to the client, we are absolutely forgetting the philosophy and only on the lawyer side to ensure that the client gets a relief. So that part of me, I think, putting it aside, the tribunal, I think, give the total credit to Mr. Arvind Datar. In 2004, when the first Madras Bar Association case came up, wherein the Companies Amendment Act 2002 was held unconstitutional by the Madras High Court by Justice Jaisam Babu Division Bench as he then was. I was a counsel on record for the Madras Bar Association, Mr. Datar reading us. From then on till the last judgment which came last month, Mr. Datar has been spearheading how to regulate the tribunals as such. So on record, I should go thanking Mr. Datar for that. That put a full stop to the NCLT coming in 2002, but coming only in 2000, I should say 16, June. So effectively, Madras Bar ensured that the tribunal has come in this form at least 13 years later. And now you have the Madras Bar again regulating the whole tribunalization as such. But on a concept of tribunalization, I do have my views completely that are we moving away from the judiciary? It's taking away a lot of powers from the judiciary. Just to give you an example, because of my practice revolving a lot around mergers and acquisitions in the context of the Companies Act, people are complaining, I mean the professionals like chartered accountants or company secretaries were complaining, why should this be a domain of the lawyers? Why can't it come to us also? So when it has moved now to the NCLT, I still see very few chartered accountants and lawyers or company secretaries alone still taking it over. The second part was courts were taking it too long to sanction an amalgamation or a demerger. Now, in fact, it's double the time if you come to the NCLT. And there are a lot of regulatory and other issues also. So I have a slightly mixed feeling about this even after 5 years. To say that, are we going in the right path? Yes. But are we going in the chosen path? I should still keep my question mark there. At the moment, I should not be very pessimistic or good. The one good thing they should do, if at all the regulators as well as the administrators, is get a good, I won't use the word training, but some kind of an awareness program continuously, which they are doing. Many of them are coming from legal backgrounds of judiciary. Technical members are coming from all departments. It's a good mix. It's a very, very good mix. But the concept of corporate law being applied in a tribunal is something which they come here and see. It will take some time to adapt. By then, their 3 years is over. Now, that is becoming an issue is what I feel. They should give them a longer tenure or 1 or 2 more tenures. This is some kind of initial remarks which I'm making subject to the other professionals who are appearing before the tribunals. Thank you, Mr. Kothari.
Extremely well made remarks, sir. And I think you've really hit the nail on its head. I'm wondering whether somebody else would also like to comment on that. But in the meantime, I'm tempted to move to another topic, which is also an extremely interesting topic, which is, and I think we had some discussion about the subordinate law versus statutory law sometime back, and people had, particularly Mr. Vasani, had extremely strong views on that. Probably it's a reflection of this very trend, which is very clearly and very forcibly seen in the 2013 law, where almost all powers of exemptions to private companies have also been taken away from the statute and put in the hands of MCA. Now, I think philosophically, the very foundation of law is that a private company is a private pool of capital. Private companies are not necessarily small companies. They're very large companies indeed, but they are basically private pools of capital. And therefore, the need for some of the regulations on private companies just does not exist. A private company, for example, my company giving a loan to me, why should somebody come and tell me whether I can or cannot give a loan to myself? Or my company entering into a transaction with me, why should they be? I mean, it's a debatable question, of course, but I'm sure everyone here understands that UK, for example, over years, and particularly in 2016, did a major relaxation, and private companies which are not so-called traded companies are relaxed from most of the provisions of law, including, for example, even the formality of holding an AGM, which for most of us is merely a minuting exercise. And I'm sure all understand that we basically do minuting of board meetings and AGMs in private companies, and that is actually the bulk of companies in the country. So this trend of keeping basic relaxations as a power of the executive and taking it away from the statute, probably this is a resonation of the point that we discussed earlier, but I'm wondering whether some of you would like to comment on that. Let's hear from our young friend Rahul Unnikrishnan, who is also a practicing lawyer, on this question. Rahul, would you like to say something? And we'll probably also like to hear from senior lawyers present here. Rahul, you're there? Perhaps
Dr.
not.
Kothari, if I could answer that question.
Yes, please. Kindly go ahead, sir.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Kothari, and a very good evening to all the eminent panelists and the viewers. This is a very relevant issue in any discussion revolving around the changing landscape of companies law in India. Just by way of background and for the benefit of our viewers, the 2013 Act originally imposed relatively high compliance standards on private companies. And this was in contrast to the 1956 Act, in which private companies were subjected to a substantially relaxed and maybe relatively straightforward compliance regime. And this was attributable to the concept, and as Dr. Kothari says philosophically, that private companies were always considered as closely held, and therefore there was no need for greater regulation of their affairs, unlike in case of public companies. So under the 1956 Act, private companies were allowed the flexibility to regulate their affairs in accordance with the terms of their constitutional documents, like the Articles of Association. Under the 2013 Act, the enhanced compliance standards were largely considered burdensome and counterintuitive. There were representations by industry associations, and finally the government issued 2 rounds of notifications in 2015 and in 17, in which compliance for private companies was again relaxed. Now, to answer your larger question whether MCA's approach in making these selective relaxations is appropriate, I don't think there can be a direct affirmative or a negative answer to this. MCA, to its credit, has been open to suggestions, and the reintroduction of relaxations was in fact on account of the representations it received and the pain points which were pointed out. Having said that, there is of course a need for certainty, sir, and stability. Repeated changes only lead to confusion, and a selective approach in that sense can create problems. And for instance, the initial compliance restrictions which were placed on companies under the 2013 Act, whether they can give loans to directors or related party transactions, from MCA's standpoint, its approach has been that there is need for adoption of good practices. But there needs to be a balance between good practices, regulatory concerns, and mitigation of difficulties faced by stakeholders.
A point well made, sir. A point well made. I mean, there can always be a scope for debate on this question, but the issue basically is the MCA has currently taken a so-called "main hoon na" approach. I'm there, main hoon na. So if there are issues, why don't you come to me and I'll resolve your issues? So instead of the main hoon na approach versus statute, going on the philosophical foundation of whether a regulation is only there where regulation is warranted. That's the basic question. But I think the question is still a controversial question, and thanks for Yuj on that. I'm coming to another question, which is probably having to do with bit of accounting, and we have 2 senior accountants here. Mr. Bhalla, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. The question is whether the provisions of Companies Act as they stand today, even though the act is as recent as 2013 draft, are they aligned with IFRS? IFRS is reality today, and a large number of larger companies have anyway moved to IFRS. But when it comes to some of the provisions which involve computation of profits or things like net worth or things like accumulated profits, it seems as if the provisions are still not keeping in tune with the provisions of IFRS. For instance, look at section 198, where the profits which are moving through P&L account are still a part of profits, or profits which are moving through other comprehensive income are a part of profits. Those questions still remain bit anchored in the pre-IFRS principles. I'm hoping, Mr. Bhalla, you can probably throw some light on that, and maybe if Mr. Kataria would like to add on, he can chip in as well. But let's hear Mr. Bhalla first. Mr. Bhalla, you there? Okay, Mr. Kataria would like to say something on that.
Yeah, I'll like to say that actually this Ind AS which have come under new rules under the Companies Act, they have more or less followed these IFRS practices, but still some areas are need to be looked into, which I think Institute of Chartered Accountants should take an initiative to help the government to draft further stringent rules to follow the practices of IFRS.
Okay, and Mr. Vasani, you were also wanting to say something?
I just wanted to complete the thing that I was a part of the expert committee appointed by government in 2016 to relook at the Companies Act 2013, wherever the gaps were there. And if you recall, that more than 100 sections were amended by Companies Amendment Act 2017. Now, one point on which I argued very vehemently before this expert committee as a member was deletion of section 198, which is completely out of sync with the current, because earlier good old days there were no proper accounting standard. This section is old section 349 of the 56 Act. So I said this section has no place to be on the statute book. Please delete it. Everybody got convinced at the last moment. I don't know what happened. Somebody from Vidhi pointed out something and they said, no, we must keep this. This is to control the managerial remuneration and all that stuff. Keep it. It was all agreed in that committee meeting that we'll drop section 198. Is absolutely not required. The then chairman of MCA, Mr. Tapan Ray, who was ex officio chairman of this committee, was completely convinced that this section deserves to be dropped. Somehow so it is a legacies of the past, relics of the past, which has no relevance today.
I completely see the points. I think you are right. Absolutely. I am now coming to a point on which I'll probably like contribution of all the panelists, and maybe even the audience could probably put their comments on the chat box. Most of the recent amendments or reforms in law, including the 2017 amendments, 2019 amendments, 2020 amendments, most of them are designed to achieve the so-called ease of doing business. Remember, that's a theme on which the government of India is aggressively moving towards. And I think they basically pick up the questions from World Bank questionnaire and make those changes which probably will lead to the question being answered in affirmative. Lots of changes recently are purely designed to address the World Bank questionnaire on ease of doing business. But over this last 4 or 5 years of reforms, let's say more than 5 years of reforms, do you all see whether we actually have moved towards, has business become easier today than it was under the 56 Act regime, or have things either, become tougher or more technically complicated? So has life actually become easier over the last 5 years? Maybe I think let's start from Mr. Ravichandran, if you would quickly like to very briefly say your views, and then I think we'll move on to other panelists also.
Yes, I agree that the government is attempting to achieve a balance between good governance and ease of doing business. They have been providing provisions, but personally speaking, provisions like 135, the amendments that are made, the compulsions that are being added, the decriminalization apart, the penal like monetary penalty, a lot of this government focus is on ease of doing business.
Mr. Kalidas, we have not heard you for quite some time. You're still there, I guess.
Yeah, I'm there, but I think this so-called ease of business is a myth as opposed to being a reality, because I don't think there is ease where it comes to even compliances as rudimentary as filing of forms. The MCA, I think the site is a relic of the past, and I don't think we are anywhere near to ease of business.
Right.
It's a paradox.
Shekhar, you want to say something?
Yeah, though a lot of improvement has been made, but yet still we have a long way to go. And human intervention has been cut down, intervention through ROC officials to that. But wherever it is there, it is a never-ending process. So
That's
I
a
guess,
technology. I mean, you're right that technology had made lots of things easier, but as
yeah,
the mindset one of making things
no,
easier,
the
no, you
mindset has
don't
not
see
changed. Things are as bad as before. And
Right.
even at the state level, if you look at, of course, this is we are talking with respect to company law. Still, a lot of approvals are required. They take their own sweet time. Though each of the states have been working towards improving their ranks in terms of doing business, but at a grassroots level, things are pretty bad, and we are nowhere near. We still need to take it as benchmark ourselves against Singapore, and then we'll
Right.
see where we are.
Shailashri, madam, would you like to comment on that? And Mr. Amit Agarwal thereafter?
Yeah,
Shailashri, madam?
the intention is very clear. There is ease of doing business, but on the ground, I hardly see anything really happening. I am talking from another regulator's perspective, and the intention is very, very, very nicely written, but approvals just don't come, and whatever you file takes its own sweet time, 4 months, 5 months. So where's the ease of doing business? The opportunity is gone by the time you get the approval.
You yourself were on the other side of the table, ma'am?
I was there many years ago. At that time, I don't think it took so much of time. In fact, it takes longer time now.
Right. Absolutely.
The
Mr. Amit Agarwal, are you there?
actually,
Sorry.
that's the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Very well point. Very well articulated. Mr. Amit Agarwal, are you there, or other panelists would like to add on that? Any of the other panelists who would like to contribute on whether we have at all achieved ease of doing business? Som sir would like to say something. Yes.
Okay, Som, you go ahead. Yeah.
So I do think we've somewhere lost our way. As someone said earlier, the path paved with the best intentions need not lead to heaven. So the intentions are all right, but the act is so individual worst case centric that it has raised the bar even for normal compliant companies. And of course, benefit analysis is very vital. The problem in our country is we don't legislate with empirical basis, and capacity constraints emerge because we've not estimated we created a tribunal, but we've not estimated what volume of work it will have. Shortly after company law, we also brought in IBC and gave that work to the same tribunal. So as someone earlier said, scheme of arrangement takes twice the time. I think Arvind said that. So those issues are to be borne in mind. So while the intentions may have been great, we have lost our way, frankly. I think it's time to do a thorough rethink. And 7 years is a long time. In India, we say the law is very young, it's only 10 years old. But anywhere else in the world, 5 years is the time to review the law. And societies are moving towards a sunset clause of 5 years, that a law automatically repeals in 5 years unless renewed. That forces you to review empirical data. So 7 years down the line, I think there's a lot to be revisited in this law, and we have lost our way. And this is, let's remember, a very bipartisan, multi-party legislation. All political parties of all colors supported this law. And corporate India assumed this law will never get legislated. And one fine morning it was in 2013. So I do think it's time for a very deep dive empirical review to see what we can do to fix this.
May I interrupt, sir?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Actually, we have moved forward, way forward from the physical filings to e-filings. Definitely, ease of doing compliances is much more there than it used to be before. But the intention of the ministries, even the citizen charter, they are not revising for 4 or 5 years on the website itself. So complacency lies there, actually.
I think Mr. Bharatapasani also wanted to add.
Just one
Mr.
quick thing.
Arvind Patil, for sure.
Yeah, just one quick thing. I just wanted to say that, while at the Prime Minister's office level, there's a very honorable intent to facilitate ease of doing business. But, laws today are not made only by Parliament. They are made 10 times more proportion by the regulators. and somewhere the message is getting lost. See, the classic example is the recent SEBI amendment of LODR for forensic audit. Is a classic case. So we are somehow losing the message in the process, and regulators are making so frequent changes in laws and regulations. Stability in legal regime is a undesirable, it's a totally desirable objective, but it's completely destroyed today with frequent changes in laws and regulations. I think RBI and SEBI are competing with each other. How many changes one can make, in every regulation they have framed. They are competing with each other. And I think SEBI has won last year's award.
Mr. Arvind Pandian.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to...
Every year's award, not only last year.
I just want to add to what Mr. Somsekhar and Mr. Kothari had mentioned. I'm actually part of the state government for the last about 8 years. On one side, I'm a corporate lawyer, but on another side, I am a law officer of the state. And it's given a completely two different dimensions to me. I would like to really compliment the government because, you take one file, it doesn't really bother whether X, Y, Z has been sitting. A file is so easy to read through and you get a continuity. But when a same corporate client comes to me in the evening with a case, you will find that all the documents are in emails, completely haphazard, up and down. There's no continuity. Only thing they have is maybe their accounts for the regulator, what they've done. So the fundamental thing is what I see, maybe when Som gets into the High Court, he'll get to know it much better. The point is the regulators are more organized. If I put it more clearly, they have the freedom of thought, but they don't have the freedom to act. In the private sector, you have a freedom to act, but you surely don't have the freedom of thought in the system because it's promoter driven. So the ease of doing business from the regulator side and from the corporate side, if you see, balancing is, I think, the most important point. Taking India as a social, I would say, setup. You really cannot say whether we are totally capitalistic on one side or totally social. We have moved away a lot from the socialistic side. So the ease of doing business, according to me, will be a process and will continue to be a process alone. And reaching it, for me, I don't see the end. It's like reaching the sun. But we need to move on the process. That's my personal view.
Absolutely. I think at this stage, I would like to pass back to Mr. Arjun Bhargav or Priyanka, as I think we are done with our time of 1.5 hours.
Yes. Thank you,
right.
sir. Thank you. And as with all great discussions, time has just flown by. I'm sure we would have liked to continue with this. But Priyanka, even though I think we are a couple of minutes over schedule, can we quickly put in some questions we got in the chat box? And I'll request the panelists to be very brief in the response.
Yep. So the second question is, in the process of decriminalization of offences, Companies Act is getting diluted over a period of time beyond requirement. What the deterrence was there, still several irregularities took place. Now, in view of ease of doing business, the ease of living, the Act is going to the other extreme of relaxations. Views, please.
Shall I take that?
Sure.
Yes, sir, please.
Okay, I think we need to think as a society. We somehow feel criminalizing will achieve virtue. So when Nirbhaya happened, we brought in extraordinary criminal sanction, but nothing happened, right? There are worse atrocities happening after that. We have the worst prevention of corruption. I mean, the most stringent prevention of corruption law in the world. Has it affected corruption? No. So we need to rethink whether this so-called criminalizing and creating a serious criminal sanction by itself is going to achieve virtue. And if we empirically find that it does not, we have to have a rethink. And frankly, 2013 Act has a number of provisions which were not backed by a cost-benefit analysis or an empirical study of whether criminalizing or making the sanctions stringent would achieve the virtue that we desire. So now, if that is being cleaned up, we should have the capacity to embrace it. This is my own personal view. I'm sure this is a very controversial subject and there'll be completely divergent views. But let's assume for a minute we have introduced capital punishment in the Companies Act for fraud. Do we think fraud is going to come down? The answer is no. We've got to rethink whether criminalization is something that is going to achieve the purpose we desire.
We also heard the views of Mr. Vasani on that, but I would just like to say criminality for corporations is a topic which has been broached all over the world. I think US also has done a lot of work in the so-called decriminalization, and the larger view which is coming from world over is that when it comes to corporate offenses, think of monetary penalty. The idea of decriminalization is not that you can violate the law flagrantly. The idea basically is that let it be punished with a monetary penalty instead of incarceration. Custodial punishment for a pure technicality. For example, think of a breach of limit of investments. And that's something which technically may happen with any company. Such an offense as breaching the limit of loans and investments leading to 6 months in jail, is it actually, I mean, is it something that will lead to right corporate governance? That's a question. But maybe somebody else might also like to add on, but Priyanka, otherwise, over to you.
I think now, just to wind up, let's take one last comment or question from the audience themselves. So I think I see Mr. Girish Papat has his hand up. Sir, would you like to add in with something? Mr. Girish, if you could unmute yourself.
Yes, I think the first query on the borrowing was on secretarial audit, applicability of secretarial audit. That 100 crore raised a query, no? I just wanted to mention that.
Right, sir. Right. Thank you.
So the question is whether the limit is based on last year's financial statements or current year's financial statements. Normally, it should be based on audited last year's. That would mean in 2021, it should be based on 1920 financial statements. That's the way I would see it. But Mr. K.S. Ravichandran might perhaps also have something to say on that.
Correct, sir.
Yeah, that's the correct view.
I second you. That's the way it should be.
Right. So Priyanka, over to you.
The last question is promoter per se is not a related party under the definition of related party. Why so?
Priyanka, you must see listing agreement also. There is a provision in the listing agreement, listing regulations, wherein there is a capturing of this requirement of promoters and this 20% voting power linked to the related party. All the people in the group are connected and they are treated as like there is some sort of higher threshold for listed companies.
And also you need to also take into consideration the definition of related party as per accounting standards, because for listed company that also comes in. So it's a very complicated definition, but I think by and large, those parties which actually are related will get roped in.
In fact, I had a question on this point. I had a question for the panel, but I think we'll reserve it for a later day. The point was that the divergence between the Companies Act and the SEBI regulations is widening by the day. Although it would be wishful thinking for for a harmonization of both provisions, ideally, to my mind, if there is a convergence, from a compliance perspective, there would be huge amount of avoidance of duplicacy in terms of compliance. So, for instance, the related party, the concept is different into the Act and in the regulations. Similarly, you do not have the same thresholds where it comes to materiality. So the ideal situation perhaps would have been for us to have a convergence between the regulations and the Act, but that probably is not going to happen because, as somebody said, SEBI is competing probably to ensure that there are more and more changes. And probably in terms of speed, companies, MCA is a little slower. So here it's a case of the hare winning the race as opposed to the tortoise.
Mr. Pandian wanted to come in. Mr. Pandian?
No, I just wanted a light having put it. If you compare the relative definition in Income Tax Act, Companies Act, and the IBC now, you will find many of the relatives missing in a light way. So I think relative itself definition has to be relooked for purposes of all acts. In fact, today when I was arguing in a case where the personal guarantor issue was coming up before the High Court, Section 5 of the IBC code defines what a related party is and the relatives come. But for a personal guarantor, the section doesn't seem to apply. So something I discovered that some personal guarantor can escape using his relatives. But the idea was, what I wanted to put across to just close was, please compare these three acts and understand who are relatives and who are not for respective acts.
I would like to add here the missed ones are the blessed ones. Missed ones are the blessed ones.
Right, sir. Yeah, so with that, I would like to thank our chief editors, panelists, and the audience for taking out time and joining us for this event. And I'm sure that we all have benefited from such a stimulating discussion. So please take care and stay safe in this, COVID era. So yeah, thank you
Thank you,
everyone.
thank you all.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye.